To Save a Hobbit by Random Plot Bunny. Chapter 13. Gentle fingers lightly playing with the hair at the nape of his neck pulled him from his deep sleep. "Stop that, it tickles!" he giggled out while trying to bat the offending hand away. Once the hand had withdrawn, he tried to snuggle once more into his soft and warm bed, but was stopped by a familiarly unfamiliar voice calling his name. Opening his eyes to catch sight of his sleep-interrupting caller, he came wide awake at the sight that greeted him. "Dwarves!" he yelled out joyfully as he sat up and straddled his narrow mattress. Why did he have such a narrow mattress again? And looked at the crowd of happy-seeming dwarves around him. Catching sight of two very tall and elegant figures standing behind the dwarves, he made another exclamation while beginning to bounce up and down in glee. "An elves! I've always wanted to meet elves!" Hearing an oomph from his mattress at his energetic movements, he looked down and noticed that he wasn't sitting on a mattress at all. He was sitting on top of a man. "Who are you?" he asked politely from his position atop the man's stomach. "Smaug," the man answered with a raised brow, clearly questioning why he felt the need to ask. Tilting his head to one side, he continued to look down at the man under him while he tried to process that answer. That name sounded very familiar. "God, Smaug!" he finally shouted as he finally remembered who Smaug was supposed to be, and then he began to elaborate. "Smaug is a giant fire-breathing dragon! He's covered in scales and has humongous wings! You're just a pretty man! So don't say you're someone you're obviously not!" He finished by glaring down at the man with the sternest expression he could muster. The nerve of this man trying to impersonate his friend Smaug like that! Good thing he was here to set matters right. As his glare was met only with a self-satisfied smirk from the man under him, he prepared to give another lecture on just why this man couldn't be a dragon when his attention was diverted. "She sure didn't exaggerate about his being confused on first awakening, did she? He makes what Biffer went through seem like a regular morning routine. You forget, for Biffer, that was a regular morning routine, or it used to be at least." Turning to look at where this strange conversation seemed to be coming from, he got quite the shock. "Dwarves!" he exclaimed in excitement. Spotting the two tall figures standing behind the group of dwarves, he began trying to stand up. "And elves! I've always wanted to meet the elves!" Beginning to struggle, why was standing up so difficult? He looked down to see that a man he seemed to be sitting on had wrapped his long arms around his slim hips and was keeping him in place. Scowling down at the man, he shook a finger at him. "Let me go this instant! I'm warning you! I'm on good terms with a dragon, and he won't be pleased if he sees you holding me like this. And who are you anyway? How did you get down here?" His laughter erupted off to his right. He looked over and was surprised. Dwarves! And elves! He'd always wanted to meet the elves, and they seemed to be getting along and laughing with each other. Who knew that that was possible? Trying to rise and join the celebrations. What was so amazing that elves and dwarves would celebrate together? He was stopped by a pair of strong arms pulling him down to lay on a smooth and bare chest. "Who are you?" he asked as he met two very blue and piercing eyes set in an angular face. "I'm Smaug, little one. We've been over this already," the man said with a bit of a smirk. Pushing his finger into the man's face, he began to rant, even as he was pulled down flat and covered with a blanket. "Don't lie to me! Smaug is a beautiful and amazing dragon, and you're just a very pretty man. Being pretty doesn't give you the right to usurp someone else's name!" His rant was met by a deep, rumbling laugh under his ear. Where was it coming from? And a voice he didn't bother to look for the source of. "I'm glad you think I'm pretty, Bilbo. Now sleep, your reason will return to you soon." His eyes already closing, he drifted off to sleep, even as he wondered about what the voice had said. His reason was fine. It hadn't gone anywhere. Deciding that the voice was just being silly, he let sleep claim him. As Bilbo lay sleeping once more, Smaug let his fingers resume their path through the burnished locks of soft hair atop his hobbit's head. And wasn't that an odd thing? A dragon with fingers! He had never heard of the like before, but it was a necessary change he'd had to complete in order to save Bilbo's life. A shriek of agony ripped from his throat as he focused all of his energies inward, trying to compress all his great mass down into a smaller form. "Come on now, you can do better than that!" Again! The she-elf who had told him of the process demanded, and he tried again. With a sound like tearing flesh, and the feeling of it too, Smaug finally succeeded. He writhed on the ground, uncomprehending for long moments why the world suddenly looked so big. Finally! It took you long enough to get it right, Langeth said as she surveyed his new form. The first time is always the hardest, so you will need to practice this at a later time if you wish to make it easier on yourself. Smaug just looked up at her from his position on the floor. I hate you, he said, and she just smiled. The steps to make his blood usable for healing were fairly simple, even if the execution of them was harder than it seemed at first glance. Number 1. Shrink himself down into a smaller form. Elf size was what was normally used. This would concentrate the magic in his blood and make it more malleable to his will. Number 2. Bite through his skin and suck out a mouthful of blood, a much harder task than it sounded. The skin of his smaller form would be made up of the compressed scales of his normal form, and so would be even harder, almost impossible, to pierce. And then there was the draconic healing to contend with. He had to be quick to draw his blood, or the wound would close up over his own teeth. Number 3. Mix his blood with his saliva thoroughly. All dragons were immune to their own poisons, and this immunity also carried in their saliva. Mixing his blood with it would kill off all remaining poison that the concentrating of his magic hadn't already done. Number 4. Focus all his willpower onto the blood in his mouth so that it would do what he wanted and not something else entirely, which could spell disaster for the one he was trying to help. Dragon magic was apparently quite powerful and destructive if not properly focused. If his concentration wavers off his goal even for a moment, things could turn ugly very quickly. Number 5. Transfer the concentrated, non-poisonous, energized blood from his mouth to the mouth of the one he was trying to heal through a kiss. Outside of his body, his mouth in this case, his blood would no longer be subject to his will, so the quick transfer would serve to keep it stable as well as setting it to work as quickly as possible. And Smaug would privately admit to wanting to try this kiss thing that the bipeds were always doing with Bilbo, and if it was good, he might someday ask the Hobbit to join him in one while he was awake. He attempted to stand after the transformation, but found it difficult. How on Middle-earth did these bipeds manage to do this? So instead, he chose to crawl to the spot that he had left Bilbo laying in. Too still, barely breathing now, unconscious as he had been since Thorn's attack, and was about to try and bite through his wrist and start the process when he was stopped. You will need to practice first, or else you can make a mistake and harm him more, Langeth stated while grabbing his wrist in a strong grip to prevent him from biting into his own flesh. And just how do you expect me to practice? No one else here is injured, let alone as bad off as Bilbo is, he snarled out as he pulled his wrist from her grip, though he didn't try to bite into it as he had seen her point. Maybe no one is as bad off as he is now, but there is someone here that could be considered just as badly injured, if no more so, Langeth said as she turned to the watching crowd of dwarves, and one dwarf in particular. Bifur swallowed as every eye in the room turned on him. He may be easily confused about many things, but understanding what everyone wanted from him now was not one of those. Stepping forward, he pounded his chest to signal that he was willing to be the test subject here, if it meant his friend would have a better chance of survival. Nodding graciously to the be-axed dwarf, the she-elf turned back to the waiting dragon man. I would suggest pulling the axe out when you transfer the blood. You don't want it to become even more permanently affixed. Bifur's eyes widened at that. They were simply going to rip the thing out of his skull! But there was no time to back out now, as if he would. Because the dark-haired man that had taken the place of the giant dragon was staring at him now as he bit into his own wrist. Stopping his fingers from their continuous running through Bilbo's hair, Smaug slipped out from under his hobbit and, after ensuring that Bilbo was rewrapped in the blanket and plenty warm enough, began the task of teaching himself to walk on 2 legs. He wanted to be prepared for when Bilbo awoke next, as well as for when they left the mountain behind. He didn't suppose that a hobbit traveling with a dragon would be welcome in many places, but a hobbit and a man? The whole of the world would be theirs. So, first lesson. Standing. When Bilbo next awoke, it was to the rumbling of an empty stomach and the smell of good food. Sitting up from atop a mattress made of cushions, though he had a vague memory of a dream, he looked around until he spotted the spot that the good smells were coming from. Throwing off his blankets, he stood and made his way over, never noticing the eyes watching him from almost every corner of the cavernous room they were in. "Smells good," he chirped, making Bomber and Biffer jump where they were sitting next to the cooking fire. As his friends turned to greet him, he thought he noticed something different about Biffer. But that thought instantly fled once Bomber started dishing him up a large plate of delicious-looking food as well as a big bowl of thick stew. He had just started on his second bowl of stew. Bomber was having a hard time keeping up with him, but the rotund dwarf was just managing to keep his plate stacked high when his mind circled back around to what could be different about his friend. With a gasp that had him choking on his most recent mouthful, he realized what was different. Quickly swallowing, he pointed wide-eyed at his friend and asked, "Biffer, where's your axe?" Bomber broke into laughter and, much to Bilbo's confusion, started making kissing noises that he aimed at his cousin, who was glaring at a point just behind Bilbo's head. Before I could turn to find out what, if anything, his friend was looking at, an argument started that drew everyone's attention. "He asked directly about the axe fee. That means I won." "No way, kid. He had already started eating. That means I won." "No! Me! No! Me!" Shaking his head as the brothers started brawling in an attempt to settle their differences, Bilbo turned back to his friend and caught his attention. "Biffer, how—" His friend huffed as his cheeks went red. Was he embarrassed? Why? This was something they should be celebrating. And glared again over Bilbo's shoulder. "Ask the dragon," he growled in perfect Western, confused over that answer. And just where was Smog at, anyway? He almost missed the fact that his friend was able to speak in the common language. He sat stunned and staring until the warm body dropped down to sit next to him. "Aye, lad, it is a lot to take in, I know. But it is good to hear him speaking clearly again after so long," Oin said as he slyly filled Bilbo's bowl up once more. His attention brought back to the food, Bilbo began eating again, although he still gave half an eye to the old healer by his side. "But how did it happen?" he managed to ask as he finally started to slow down, finally starting to feel full. "I'll answer that in a moment, lad, but first I want to ask you a question, and I want you to think about the answer very hard before giving it to me. Alright?" Nodding his agreement, he waited for Oin to ask. "Lad, how do you feel?" Looking at his old friend in confusion, he went to answer, and then stopped. Exactly how did he feel? Nothing hurt. He wasn't tired anymore. Maybe he was still a little hungry, especially if Bomber had dessert made. He felt fine, actually. He felt fine. Turning to stare owlishly up at his friend, he took several long moments to find his voice. I feel fine. I feel just fine, Oin. How... Trailing off, he looked over at Biffer, putting two and two together and still not understanding what was going on. "Aye, lad, you and Biffer were healed the same way, by the same person, though for different reasons." Who? How? He breathed out, hardly able to believe what was happening. He felt fine. He was fine again, healthy. He might even be able to return to the Shire. That was a sobering thought, though he would love, absolutely love, to see Lobelia's face upon his return. Oin placed a comforting hand around his shoulders as he began to explain. "It seems that many things were lost in the first wars, including many secrets concerning dragon magic." Bilbo gasps at that, realizing just what Biffer had been trying to tell him. Even Smaug, though he is a dragon, didn't know much of anything about it, but he worked hard to learn once he realized it could be used to save your life. Where? He asked, needing to see his large, scaly friend and thank him. "Right here, little hobbit. Did you think that I would just leave you?" A smooth, deep, not as loud as he was expecting, voice said from right behind him, from right where Biffer kept directing his glares. Turning, expecting to see a dragon, even though he knew that there wasn't enough room between him and the wall for Smaug to lay, all the Hobbit saw was a man. A man he remembered from a dream. It wasn't a dream, he squeaked out, making the man smirk. No, it wasn't. Do you really think I'm a pretty man? Bilbo nods dazedly. Everything. His renewed health, Biffers, Smaug's appearance, all becoming too much suddenly. And you're a good mattress, too, were his last words before the world turned black. Oin caught him just as he slumped, fainted into a dead heap. And I won that bet, too! Kaylee yelled after the ensuing silence, causing everyone to roll their eyes. As Oin made the small man comfortable, Smaug stood and made his way over. It hadn't taken him long to teach himself to walk, less than an hour, and he had been all set to settle back down with his hobbit, but had been stopped by a compelling argument made by one of the older dwarves. He thought that maybe Balin had been his name. He hadn't wanted to startle the small man. No one did. By giving him too much to think about too soon, and Smaug had agreed. So he had accepted the cloak the dwarf handed him. They had been trying to give him one since he first stood up. What was with these people and this modesty concept? As he felt Bilbo might approve of it, and had settled down to wait with the others for the small man to awake. And now that Bilbo was finally awake and beginning to understand, Smaug, the last of the great dragons, would not be leaving his side again, if he could so help it.